Television, it opened our eyes to the world. From silent films to the talkies, it gave Hollywood films a voice. They were all inventions of the Roaring '20s. A decade of jazz, freewheeling flappers, and bootlegged booze. The television, the lie detector, and the liquid-fueled rocket were all inventions that shook the world. In modern cinemas, sound is crucial. It brings monsters to life and intensifies explosions. Although these scenes were silent in the films of the 1920s, silent movies were still all the rage. But there were many devices and many inventors trying to give the stars of the silver screen a voice too. Lee De Forest was one such man. Already a famous inventor, he was not famous enough. He wanted to be a household name, just like Thomas Edison.
He was, shall we say, a unique and difficult individual to work with, to put it mildly. He had very stormy relationships with his professional associates. He fell out with a lot of them. He was a very, very famous litigator. He would sue anybody and everybody. He worked best alone. He was a maverick. He certainly looked for ways of doing things that had been rejected by others.
De Forest's main feat was the Audion tube in 1906, which boosted telephone signals, so enabling long-distance calls. But 14 years later, at age 47, he was desperate to come up with a big, new idea that would keep him in the limelight.
That man is so handsome. I can only imagine what he sounds like.
De Forest thought that if he were able to bring sound to movies, he would become a worldwide sensation.
De Forest was a one-horse race in many things. The Audion tube electrical amplification was the one fundamental core technology that really defined him, in the way that some would argue that the light bulb itself, the filament tube, defined Edison. With his background in audio engineering and amplification, that developing a working sound on film system was about the one last thing that he could do and he could make work as the lone inventor working in his back room.
De Forest, like others at the time, discovered that recording sound and film were two totally different technologies.
De Forest talking picture test number 1. This test is to determine the potential of a gramophone disc as a sound receptacle and playback device.
De Forest used a horn, which acted in a similar way to a microphone to capture the sound waves produced by his voice. Those sound waves then vibrated a needle and etched his words into the grooves of a soft wax disc. But when De Forest tried to match the gramophone disc recording with a moving picture, there was a fundamental problem.
De Forest talking picture test number 1. This test is to determine the potential of a gramophone disc as a sound receptacle and playback device.
The mouths and the words kept going out of sync. It just didn't work. De Forest returned to his workshop with a glimmer of an idea. What about using light to record the sound right onto the film, just like the picture?
Which meant it always stayed in synchronization with the picture. They were physically the same bit of film, so they couldn't not stay in synchronization.
Testing.
De Forest connected a microphone to a light bulb device he called a photon.
Testing.
As the sound got louder, the light bulb would get brighter. As the sound got quieter, the light bulb would get dimmer.
After months of trial and error, De Forest was finally ready for a test run.
This test is to determine the potential of sound exposed on film.
Inside the camera, the flickering photon exposed the sound of his voice onto the film. As it shifted from dim to bright, the photon created a vertical barcode down the edge of each frame. Each pulse of light created a stripe that varied with the rhythm and intensity of his voice. But would this optical sound work when played back? De Forest developed the film and played it through a projector that converted the optical soundtrack back into sound. It played in perfect sync, but there was another problem. The quality was awful. It was a huge disappointment. De Forest was on the verge of success. But if he didn't create a clearer sound, his idea would be useless.
He was also running out of money.
De Forest realized what the problem was. His flickering photon bulb that exposed the sound onto the film wasn't sensitive enough to accurately reproduce human speech. He was forced to admit that he needed help.
Mr. De Forest, Theodore Case, at your service.
Theodore Case, a former Navy engineer, had also worked on sensitive light signaling technology.
The working relationship between De Forest and Case was a problematic one, to put it mildly. In short, Lee De Forest saw phonofilm as his legacy project, if you like. Case saw his collaboration with De Forest as a way of boosting his own career. He had his own agenda.
De Forest knew he needed Case, but he was not keen on sharing the glory.
De Forest had very, very difficult working relationships with his closest collaborators. So instead of working with them in a way that mutually benefited them both, he wanted to go home with all the prizes.
However, Case needed De Forest's big name to boost his career, as much as De Forest needed Case's better light technology. Case added a tiny, highly sensitive light bulb, an exciter lamp, to De Forest's sound system. It captured greater degrees of brightness than the photon bulb, so was far more sensitive to the nuances of the voice. It could be the missing piece of the puzzle. Several months later, they were finally ready for a test. Whether or not their relationship was working, the important thing was how the new light bulb performed. De Forest's legacy rode on this test.
De Forest talking picture. Sorry. De Forest and Case, test number 3.
This time, the sound was perfectly clear. De Forest and Case had succeeded with their system.
I think it will make us both very, very rich men.
De Forest then arranged a screening with one of his high-powered connections, Hugo Reisenfeld.
Case, roll the projector.
A musical director at the Rivoli, the New York theater known for its fabulous acoustics. The era of silent movies was set for change. De Forest called his system phonofilm, and Reisenfeld couldn't get enough of it.
Told you.
He snapped up the rights for the world premiere. On April the 15th, 1923, De Forest unleashed his phonofilm system onto the US.
The underlying principle that Lee De Forest packaged up and made work was long-lived, and it's still with us in very many theatres around the world.
He never became as famous as the screen stars, but in 1959, De Forest was awarded the one thing every Hollywood star covets, an Oscar for his pioneering invention. More inventions of the 1920s. 1926, the chainsaw. The machine that could cut down 20 trees a day. 1925, cycle skates. Part skiing, part skating. But they failed to go anywhere. And in 1928, sliced bread arrived in the shops. Since the 1950s, thousands of spacecraft have been launched beyond Earth's atmosphere and into space. So much so that spaceflight is now taken for granted. However, for the father of modern liquid fuel rockets, it was a tough struggle to find believers. 1915, Robert Goddard headed for his lab at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was a brilliant professor of physics and was also eccentric with an outrageous idea. If the world knew where he wanted to send those rockets, they'd have called him crazy. It all began when he was just 17 and when he climbed a cherry tree.
The story is that Robert Goddard climbed into that cherry tree and he started daydreaming. Now that's something that Goddard did a lot of. Don't know how long he was up in that tree, but he had an idea that we could get to space, and he wanted to be the person that did that.
Getting into space seemed such a crazy idea at a time when airplanes were just taking off. But Goddard always had his own ideas about how to make things move, even if his experiments seemed strange to others. By his early 30s, Goddard was still obsessed with making spaceflight possible, and he thought he knew how. Goddard didn't see fireworks as entertainment. He saw them as a way of getting into space.
Fireworks are solid fuel rockets. You take a bunch of powder, you pack it into an enclosed space, you put sort of a wick in there, you light it, and off it goes with a big boom.
Goddard thought that this simple concept, igniting solid fuel, would propel a rocket into space. But he needed to discover how to make the powder burn in a more controlled way, so it didn't explode in one go.
So at night, he would go home and he started the basics of what became his long career in rocketry. Testing different components, working with different powders.
He imagined a special combustion chamber at the base of the rocket. He would fill the chamber with a solid fuel explosive, such as gunpowder. On ignition, powder would be fed into the combustion chamber bit by bit. So instead of igniting in one big blast, the rocket would be carried aloft by a series of staggered explosions. It was a whole new way of thinking about flight, and Goddard thought about it day and night.
It's said that Robert Goddard was so busy at night that he couldn't tell you the next day what he had had for supper.
In a remote corner of the campus, Goddard started working on small-scale models. He recorded the power of their upward thrust and calculated what would be needed for a full-sized rocket. His progress was slow and tedious, and all the time, Goddard tried to keep his work secret.
They were constantly trying to get Robert Goddard to write up his findings. And he didn't want to do it because he was afraid, one, they'd get stolen, and two, people would think he was a nut.
Goddard discovered that only 2% of the energy produced by the burning fuel contributed to thrusting the rocket upward. Not enough power to get anywhere near space. He searched for something to increase the engine's thrust and uncovered a steam engine part called a de Laval nozzle. Goddard thought he found his solution. The hourglass shape of the de Laval nozzle forced the hot gases from the combustion chamber to move 8 times faster as they squeezed through the narrow part of the tube. Goddard thought that as it expanded again, the exhaust flow would be converted into powerful kinetic energy, blasting the rocket to speeds unheard of at the time.
The de Laval nozzle really moved Robert Goddard's ability to achieve what he wanted to achieve forward at a faster pace.
In the summer of 1915, Goddard was experimenting with a de Laval nozzle. He calculated the thrust and discovered that the new nozzle boosted the fuel's efficiency from 2% to an astonishing 63%. Still not enough to put a life-size rocket into space, but it proved that the theoretical dream of spaceflight was turning into a real possibility. But his problems were far from over. Goddard was running out of money, as he had been paying for his obsession out of his teaching salary.
He learned pretty quickly that he couldn't live and do rocketry at the same time. Couldn't pay his bills, couldn't eat. And so that's when he sent his first letter to the Smithsonian Institute and started to ask for money.
To try to get funding, he had to publish his work. So he wrote a paper about his experiments with solid fuel and the theoretical possibilities of exploring space. The paper earned him a $5,000 grant from the Smithsonian, but he was also ridiculed in the press. The New York Times declared the idea of rocket travel preposterous.
He could have said, yeah, well, maybe they're right, and spent the rest of his career teaching. Perseverance was in his nature. Overcoming was in his nature.
Goddard continued his work, but then encountered a new problem. As he experimented further, it became clear that solid fuel was not going to work. It was just too hard to control, as test after test ended in failure. Goddard had worked for 2 decades, and with the failure of solid fuel, it seemed as if it had all been for nothing.
Robert Goddard never gave up. You can look back on his career, and you can see all these things that went wrong. They looked like failures. He tended to look at it as, okay, this is what went wrong. How can we fix it to make it better the next time?
So he went back to an idea he'd had 10 years before. Replace solid fuel with liquid fuel. He began experimenting with petrol, and to make it burn with more power, liquid oxygen. He hadn't tried liquid fuel before because liquid oxygen had always been too expensive to buy and too difficult to handle. It had to be kept extremely cold, but he finally had the resources to experiment with it. He discovered that the petrol and liquid oxygen mixture was not only more controllable than solid fuel, it also had more energy per unit. The fast-moving, high-pressure stream of hot gases should add huge power to the thrust of the rocket. It was the last key ingredient. Goddard thought he finally had his fuel.
To be successful, he had to develop, to invent, to create the liquid fuel engine.
Goddard designed the liquid fuel engine with 2 lines running into its combustion chamber, one feeding fuel, the other oxygen. The liquid oxygen would be extremely cold, but the combustion it produced would be extremely hot. To prevent overheating, the cold liquid oxygen would cool the combustion chamber as it traveled from the fuel tank. Goddard was ready to take his experiment out of the lab and into the field to test the new fuel.
March 16th, 1926, this is going to be the test.
And anything might happen.
The December prior, he'd gotten 1 foot off the launch pad before it fizzled out and didn't go anywhere.
It was one man who had been ridiculed, pursuing his dream against all the conventional wisdom of the day. There was nothing left to do but take a deep breath. For 20 of the longest seconds of Goddard's life, nothing happened. And then it took off. The rocket shot 12 meters into the air and landed 44 meters away. Goddard had proved that his concept would fly. In 1926, it was the most powerful rocket ever launched. During the next 20 years, Goddard launched more than 50 liquid fuel rockets. Scientists in Europe and America were soon building rockets based largely on Goddard's innovative work. But Goddard's real dream didn't come true until 1969, 24 years after his death. The Saturn V rocket, powered by a liquid fuel engine, blasted the Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon.
Everything that was achieved was built on the technology that he spent 2 or 3 decades struggling to make work.
The New York Times published a retraction of its mocking editorial 49 years previously. Goddard had been right after all. Robert Goddard is now recognized as the father of space exploration, and there is even a crater named in his honor on the moon. More inventions of the 1920s. 1924, frozen food, patented by an American naturalist who learned all about flash freezing from the Inuit.
By 1957, no less than half America's food money will be spent on frozen packs.
1922, the first 3D feature film premiered in Los Angeles, complete with stereoscopic glasses. And 1920, the 3-color traffic light. While Henry Ford was putting a car in every driveway, a Detroit policeman came up with a way to keep them on the move.
It produced false confessions, it made citizens and suspects resentful.
John Larson was not an ordinary police officer. He was a medical student with a PhD in physiology and had a passion for how science could help solve crimes. Larson believed there must be a more civilized way to extract a confession. As a physiologist, he had noted a suspect's physical responses: darting eyes, sweating brow, his shifting body language. It reminded Larson of a Harvard psychology experiment that tried to determine whether someone was lying by measuring spikes in their blood pressure. The study's results were mixed, but Larson thought, what if he could create a machine that would monitor not just blood pressure, but several physiological responses? The criminal's own body might reveal whether he was telling the truth or not. It took Larson 6 weeks to hunt for the best instruments to monitor physiological responses. And with the help of a technician, he put them all together into a single device. The machine contained 3 separate instruments that would measure the suspect's blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing. All were wired into a central device and connected to 3 needles that passed over a rolling drum of paper. As questions were answered, minute fluctuations in each physiological response would cause the needles to vibrate, recording them in a continuous line. Larson reasoned, the stronger the vibrations, the greater the chance the suspect was lying. It was time to test the prototype lie detector. Larson believed that for the invention to work, he had to develop a standard procedure for asking questions.
Well, let's give this a try and see how it works. First question, what is your name?
David Johnson.
How long have you been married?
It's important to get people responses to completely innocuous questions like, did you have a cigarette this morning? So that you can compare that to the more intensely probing questions about the crime. And so you want to measure relevant and irrelevant questions, and you also want to test their response to generic, highly accusatory questions.
As Larson quizzed further,
have you ever been attracted to another woman other than your wife?
The test subject's physical reactions began to change.
No.
It showed he was uncomfortable and maybe lying. It was the response Larson needed. Over several weeks, he fine-tuned the way he asked questions. In test after test, his machine confirmed a consistent pattern of physiological responses. Larson was ready to test his device during an actual police criminal investigation. A series of robberies at a Berkeley sorority house.
Cash was missing from drawers, jewelry had gone missing, and a diamond ring had been lost by Margaret Taylor, a freshman from San Diego.
Police were sure it was an inside job. It was down to Larson to find out which of the 90 sorority girls was the thief. Larson called in 14 of them, both possible suspects and clearly innocent controls.
Larson standardized the questions he asked to all the women he interrogated in the College Hall case, as he would do in every case he ever ran. It's important that every single suspect be presented with the same questions. They included innocent questions and ones that were more pointed and directed towards their knowledge of the crime.
Larson systematically worked through the list, but the girls displayed no signs of physiological stress until he came to Helen Graham. She was a student nurse from Kansas.
That machine's going to measure your heart rate and your pulse. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I want you to answer them just as honestly as possible.
Well, I'll be telling the truth.
Are you about ready to go? Is your name Helen Graham?
Yes.
Are you a student at Berkeley College?
Yes.
And as he worked through the questions, moving from those that were relatively innocuous and innocent questions to the one that pertained to the crime, he noticed that her blood pressure began to rise very dramatically.
Helen, do you know who took the ring?
No.
Did you take the money, Helen?
No.
The machine's needles clearly indicated he had found his thief.
I want to get out of here right now.
Before Larson obtained a confession, Graham stormed off. But the lie detector test had shaken her. Several days later, she confessed.
I just saw it there, and I just took it, and I'm not a bad person.
The lie detector had notched up its first success. It had, for the first time, fingered the guilty party in a crime.
How Larson's test had exposed the thief made the front page of newspapers across the U.S.
But notice right away how it had done so. The lie detector had worked in the College Hall case because it made one of the people feel so guilty that they confessed to the crime. And that is how the lie detector has worked ever since.
The lie detector isn't foolproof, so its results are only rarely accepted in court. But its psychological effect is huge and helps investigators bring new information to light. Larson's invention had one other long-lasting effect. Just 1 year later, John Larson married Margaret Taylor, the innocent victim of the crime. The biggest questions today when buying a fridge are what it can do and what it looks like. A lot easier than in the 1920s, when buying a fridge could literally cost you your life. A deadly problem that inspired the century's greatest scientist. Berlin, 1925. Albert Einstein, the Albert Einstein, solver of secrets of the universe, was about to turn inventor to keep people safe and their morning glass of milk cold.
Einstein was a very quiet person. He spoke with a slightly squeaky voice, and he was self-effacing and a bit modest.
The rest of the world saw Einstein as the greatest of scientists. He had already won the Nobel Prize in physics, and then he astounded the world of science with his theory of general relativity. But one particular morning, he was not thinking about relativity or quantum physics. He was drawn to a horrifying story in the morning paper about a fridge. A fridge that had killed an entire family overnight.
The refrigerator leaked ammonia into the apartment, which is toxic and which eventually filled the rooms and killed the family.
At the time, the household refrigerator was a recent invention, but it used deadly toxic gases such as ammonia as coolants to absorb heat from the food chamber. Einstein set himself a new challenge. Could his great mind design and build a safer fridge? And he knew just the man to help. He contacted his friend Leo Szilard, a Hungarian student physicist.
Both of them were humanitarians, both of them were pacifists, and both of them responded on a personal level when they read that a family had been destroyed by a faulty refrigerator.
Szilard himself went on to create nothing less than nuclear fission. But at the time, the pair were fixated on a fridge. They saw that the fridge had several mechanical moving parts to circulate the liquid coolant, one being a compressor pump. It rattled constantly. And that created wear and tear on the surrounding valves and seals. They realized that it was from these mechanical moving parts where the toxic coolant leaked. The challenge was to design a fridge that moved the liquid coolant without mechanical parts. As physicists, they both knew about electromagnetic energy. Einstein thought they could harness that energy to push the coolant through the fridge's coils. But to succeed, they needed an additional element. A liquid metal that was a strong conductor of electricity. Szilard suggested a sodium-potassium alloy. The idea was to send an electrical current through the liquid metal. The resulting magnetic field would turn the liquid metal into a type of piston that pushed the coolant through the refrigerator's coils. But early on in their experiments, they found a problem. The sodium-potassium alloy was too acidic, and it corroded the wires they had inserted into the tube to create a current.
So they needed another method.
Einstein's brain came up with a solution. Remove the electrical wires inside the tube and replace them with electromagnets in the form of coils around the outside.
Imagine yourself taking a string of sausage and squeezing the sausage as it goes around. The magnets were in effect doing the same thing.
By sending electricity through the electromagnets, it would create magnetic fields that penetrated the tube. The magnetic forces would push the liquid metal through the tube, forcing the fridge coolant to keep moving as well. What Einstein had developed was the world's first electromagnetic pump, a pump with no moving parts. Within a few months, they had a prototype ready to test. When they turned it on, it worked. The milk was cold, and they had made the kitchen a safer place. But their design did have a significant drawback.
It started making louder and louder sounds. Somebody who was there said it howled like a banshee.
That didn't deter the two theoretical physicists. But to lesser mortals, the howling fridge was a hard sell. What made it even harder to sell was, in 1929, scientists discovered Freon, a non-toxic coolant that eliminated the reason for the Einstein fridge. But the domestic invention conceived by the world's great brains was used in an even more important role, in nuclear power plants, cooling the reactors.
Nuclear breeder reactors are now operating around the world, and they all depend on the idea that came up in Einstein's apartment in Berlin.
It was the type of ending one would expect when two of the 20th century's greatest minds sat down to build a better fridge. Further inventions from the 1920s. 1929, the folding electric car. Perfect if you wanted to keep the car in a cupboard, but it hasn't been seen since. And also in 1929, the electric shaver takes the risk out of razors and massages its way across the chins of men everywhere.
Will give you a close, comfortable shave, no matter how tender your skin.
From high-definition massive screens to old sets in remote rural villages, television has made the world a much smaller place. It links us by the billions during events of triumph and moments of tragedy. And it's all because of a Scotsman who was at a low point but determined to make a comeback. 1923, in the seaside town of Hastings, England. Inventor John Logie Baird was hoping the fresh sea air would improve his chronic bad health. Baird was a genius, but his health problems and his life of inventing had left him broke.
My father came across as being rather withdrawn and not quite with it. You would say something to him and he wouldn't necessarily respond to it because he would be thinking of something else. But he was always polite. He studied at school until he was 18, and there was no science taught at the school where he was. They taught languages, they taught history, they taught mathematics, but he got his scientific training at the Royal Technical College in Glasgow.
His chemically saturated damp-proof socks for the troops were successful, but his inflatable pneumatic shoes never made him a penny. By the time he reached Hastings, he had little money. But Baird did have an idea that just might let him invent his way out of his predicament.
Here he was with £100 left, and he had to think of something, and that was television.
What Baird was imagining was a huge technological leap. Transmitting sound over great distances by radio was still new, so transmitting moving pictures seemed like science fiction. He set to work on how to transmit moving pictures through the air. He sketched a device that he hoped would work. He began with a disc fitted with a spiral of perfectly spaced holes. Powered by an electric motor, the disc would spin in front of an image. As it span, each hole in the spiral allowed a tiny slice of the image to pass through. A light sensor would pick up these little image slices and convert them into a series of electrical pulses. The pulses would then be transmitted via radio waves to a transceiver that read the signal of the pulses. It would then reconstruct the original image onto a second spinning disc. Baird started work using scavenged parts, knitting needles, a bike light lens, a biscuit tin, and hat box.
He started from scratch, really, with television. He bought a few components, he sort of put them together in his bedroom.
The hat box lid became his circular scanning disc with a spiral pattern of holes. He spun it on a knitting needle shaft. Piece by piece he assembled it using coffin wood from a local undertaker as a base. Finally, it was ready to be tested. Baird set up a simple cross in front of the scanning disc. He synchronized the receiving disc at the opposite side of the room and watched to see if his crazy contraption would work. As if by magic, an image appeared. As the receiving disc spun, it reassembled the shadowy shape of the cross. Baird was ecstatic. It proved his basic assumptions were correct. But a clear image was still a long way off.
It took him a little longer than he thought it would. It took him several years.
By 1924, Baird was living in London, which gave him better access to equipment, but the smoggy air was disastrous for his health. In a Soho flat, still penniless, he worked day and night. Slowly but surely, the blurry shapes became a little clearer. A bigger scanning disc, a more sensitive selenium light sensor to create better detail in the electrical pulses, and a lot more light. But he still couldn't find the right combination to produce photographic gradients of grey. It was vital, because without those tones, he couldn't recreate a recognizable human face.
He was beginning to lose heart. This was in late 1925. And his backer, he had a backer at that point, was becoming very impatient and wanted out.
In October 1925, the day started out like so many before. Baird placed the head of a ventriloquist dummy in front of the scanning disc. He flooded the room with light as the scanning disc began to spin. But this time, things were different. In a separate screening room, there appeared on the synchronized receiving disc the world's first ever detailed television image. He had finally found the magic combination. Baird knew at once it was a major breakthrough.
He could hardly believe his eyes, and it came as quite a shock when it eventually came.
Baird couldn't wait to do a test with a real human subject. He summoned the office boy from downstairs. 20-year-old William Tainton was terrified. He sat confused as Baird rushed back to the screening room. As the disc span, Baird instructed him to move his mouth.
William, stick out your tongue!
William Tainton, the first human face ever to be seen on TV. John Logie Baird and his miraculous new invention had arrived. This first recorded image from Baird's TV had only 30 lines of resolution, compared to over 500 on standard TVs today. But the features were recognizable in shades of grey. Baird took his television public. The first tiny screens were a sensation. Within 4 years, the BBC transmitted its first official TV broadcast, using Baird's mechanical system.
But in a very quiet way, I'm extremely proud of what my father did.
Because of John Logie Baird's relentless determination, the world now has television.